So, thinking of the 3 R's, where refinement is one of those, people usually think about refinement being the way we handle the animals. In this paper, I think about handling the animal's data. If we refine the way that we handle the animal's data, we do a better job of adhering to the 3 R's.
Hello and welcome to The Last Word, the official AALAS podcast dedicated to advancing laboratory animal science. I'm Jennifer Smith, Chief Scientific Officer at AALAS, and also your host. Together, we'll discuss current research, emerging trends, and the innovative work that supports scientific progress with animal welfare. We are so glad you're here. Let's discover something new together. Hello and welcome back. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Reid Landes. Reid is a professor of biostatistics at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. He received his master's degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and his PhD in statistics from Iowa State University. Reid is joining us today to talk about his recent AALAS paper titled More Power for Less Money, Statistical Power and Cost Analyses That Account for Intracluster Correlation in Experiments with Same Group Cage Mates. Hello, Reid. Thank you so much for being on here. And we are so excited to just get to know you a little bit better and to dive into the world of statistics, which for some of us, myself included, is not a super comfortable pool to jump into. So, hello. Thank you again for being on here. Yeah, just tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Okay, so I started out as a math teacher. At least that's what I wanted to be. And it turned out that wants and abilities don't always align. And so I got out of math teaching pretty quickly after a couple of years. I went back to school for a semester to take some more math classes because I wanted to use my math. And I took a stat class that was really for Aggies and biologists at the graduate level. And that's where I kind of discovered statistics. From there, I went teach as an assistant English teacher in Japan for a bit. And while there, I decided, I'm going to study statistics. So I came back, went to the biometry department at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. It's now the statistics department at Nebraska. It's in the College of Agriculture, so I was surrounded by Aggies and biologists and agronomists. It's a good time. Then I found a position at the Division of Biometry at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. And I came here for a couple of years as a staff statistician. My wife said, hey, you should just go get a PhD. I'm glad I listened to her. So we loaded up the truck and went to Iowa State University, where I got a PhD in stats. Then the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences was forming at about the time I finished my PhD. And they said, hey, you want to come back as a faculty member? And I did. So I've been here since 2005. In 2007, Max Baker was the IACUC chair of the school here and asked if I could join the IACUC as a statistician to review statistical aspects of animal use protocols. So I said, sure. So I've been on the IACUC since 2007. I did take a couple of years off to go work on studies for atomic bomb survivors in Japan, but I've come back. But altogether, I've been an IACUC statistician for 16 years. So that's a quick rundown of me with respect to statistics and animal use.
Wow. Okay. Well, I love hearing all of this. And I just want to stop for a minute and recognize what a great addition to an IACUC you would have proven to be. And kudos to Max for thinking that was a good thing to do. I cannot say enough how helpful it is to have somebody like you on the different IACUCs. And it's just a skill set that a lot of IACUC members don't have. And it's so wonderful to have you do that. And then just to kind of spill into helping us by submitting this wonderful paper, which is really what we're here to talk about. But I also want to ask you, what age children did you teach math to?
I tried to teach high schoolers.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, I can't even imagine, especially reluctant math people in high school. Yes.
They were good. It was just that it's not my forte.
Yeah.
So there you go.
I got it. I can completely understand. Well, we're selfishly thankful that you came over to our side, and wow, what a great contribution you're making to our industry. And I love highlighting this in this paper. Okay, so let's keep moving here. Tell us just kind of, you decided one day I'm going to put this all in a paper and submit it. What was kind of your impetus for getting this out there?
A common problem I see on ICUC is that the statistical analysis plans don't always line up with the experiment designs. When that happens, your animal justification numbers can be off, and it can lead to errors in your statistical analyses when you do gather your data. When we make errors in our statistical analyses, in my opinion, it seems to be kind of a waste of that animal's data, kind of a waste of the animals if we analyze them incorrectly. So, thinking of the 3 R's, where refinement is one of those, people usually think about refinement being the way we handle the animals. In this paper, I think about handling the animal's data. If we refine the way that we handle the animal's data, we do a better job of adhering to the 3 R's, if you will. So in this paper, I give a tutorial on a commonly used design in animal experiments. That is where all of the cage mates are the same experimental group, whether it's a control group or an experimental group, but they're all of the same group. In the paper, I talk about same group cage mates. That's what I'm talking about. So you'll have some cages with group E for experimental in them, and the other cages you'll have group C for control. This sort of design is really similar to in a clustered randomized trial in human trials. These sorts of study designs in humans, the statistical aspects of them have been tackled in the 90s and the early 2000s, and there's a whole lot of literature out there on cluster randomized trials, the statistics of it. However, in animal studies, especially biomedical animal studies, the statistics of how to deal with this same group cage mates business really isn't out there, at least very much. So this paper I wrote to try to educate friends that I work with and just other people on how you should analyze these data.
That is absolutely fantastic. And again, I just keep thinking at what an amazing asset to your IACUC, and just now sharing this work with us, the general, laboratory animal community. What a great gift this is to us, because you really are, and I know you're going to take us through this a little more, but you really are kind of showing us in these great examples for people maybe that just don't, again, know statistics or understand. You're kind of giving us really good real world examples of, hey, this might be a better way to approach this. I appreciate that intracluster correlation, and I really appreciate how you link that to human health trials, because a lot of us in our industry are tasked with working with the IRB as well as the IACUC in some fashion. And so we have a lot of the same skill sets. And so just being able to kind of cross populate that knowledge, I think, is really helpful. So I so appreciate that as well. All right, so you took us through a little of the introduction. Let's keep going. Will you kind of take us through? You're giving some really good examples here, and it would be good maybe if you wanted to just set the stage for those examples. There are some wonderful figures as well that will help the reader who has the paper in front of them kind of follow along on kind of what you mean by these different examples. But if you want to dive into that, that would be great.
Sure. The first thing I want to talk about real quick is intracluster correlation. That's a concept that maybe people who use laboratory animals in their research don't think about very much. However, it's things that we can see as humans in our own lives If you have a really good teacher, a really good third grade teacher, say, and then say a newer third grade teacher that isn't quite as experienced, maybe the third graders in the really good teacher's classroom has better academic performance than those in the others. The performance of those third graders in each teacher's class are more like their classmates than in the other classes. That's kind of an example of intracluster correlation. Intracluster correlation typically develops over time, however, not always. For example, if you have a surgeon who is performing a particular experimental surgery, every person that surgeon works on are going to be somehow, their outcomes are going to be somehow correlated because they have the same surgeon, right? So this intracluster correlation, though it typically develops over time, it can happen almost instantaneously. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Then I gave some examples in the paper, tried to give some examples in the paper. I didn't have any real data that I could use, so I had to come up with some example ones. But I give an example of a typical experiment that I might see on the IACUC. You've got like 3 groups, and this is from figure 1. And people often ask for 6 to 12 animals per group, right? So I said, let's go with 8 animals per group, and people will often load up their cages with as many animals as they can. So in that figure, I've got 4 animals in a cage. So I've got 2 cages with group C, 2 cages with group D, and 2 cages with group E. And it seems fine. That's a typical way that folks will set up these sorts of experiments. However, because those animals are in the same cage, maybe that intracluster correlation can develop, and how to deal with that. So in figure 1, we have that experiment, a picture of that experiment, right? I wrote the caption of figure 1 in such a way that it would address the ARRIVE guidelines. The ARRIVE guidelines are the animal research reporting in vivo experiments. It's some guidelines that are useful when reporting animal research. So I wrote that caption to describe the experiment design. When we look at this experiment design and think about the correct statistical analyses, we should take cage into account. By that I mean it is a known factor. It's not a controlled factor, but it's something that I can know. So when I collect my data from this experiment, for each animal, I'll have an animal ID. I will also have a unique cage identifier for the data from that animal, right? So in my data set, I've got animal ID, cage identifier, and then the responses from that animal. With that data, then I can start to account for this known cage, I'll call it effect, this known cage effect. And I'll put that in the statistical model. It is a variable that will go into the statistical model. So I put in treatment. Everybody thinks to put in treatment because that's the controlled factor that they're really interested in. However, cage is a known factor. It's considered random. We're not so interested in it. So I'll put that in the model as well. And when I put cage in that statistical model as one of the independent variables, then I can account for that cage to cage variability. Now, sometimes that cage to cage variability is negligible. Sometimes that cage to cage variability is, well, it's just not there. When I talk about that cage to cage variability, that shows up as intracluster correlation. If there is no cage to cage variability, then there is no intracluster correlation. However, a common misunderstanding that folks have is that, well, all these cages, they're all the same, so there should be no cage to cage variability. We cannot know if there is cage to cage variability if we don't try to estimate it, if we don't try to account for it. So when we put it into the model, we can get an idea of whether cage-to-cage variability is in there, whether that intracluster correlation is 0 or not.
It's time for a quick break to hear about the AALAS Learning Library. Hey, are you ready to elevate your team's knowledge and skills in laboratory animal science? Well, the AALAS Learning Library is your one-stop solution for comprehensive training. With courses designed for everyone, you can train your entire team in one place, earn valuable AALAS CEUs and RACE CE credits, and take advantage of group discounts to maximize that investment. Getting started is easy too. Sign up for free to access select courses instantly to explore a vast library of resources. Empower your team, stay ahead of the field, and grow with the AALAS Learning Library, your trusted resource for laboratory animal science professionals. I'm going to stop right there. You are blowing my mind. I think this is so amazing. I would love to be in the corner of the room on your IACook listening to this. So my question then would be, how accepting of this whole idea was your research community where at the institution where you are now? You know, were people thinking you were talking like you had 9 heads when you're talking about this cluster variation, or were people like, oh, yeah, that makes sense? I'm just so curious.
I'll be honest, I think that a lot of investigators are not concerned with this idea of intracluster correlation.
That's exactly what I thought you were going to say, unfortunately.
Right. And whether their lack of concern is it okay, or should they truly be concerned? Well, we can't know until we at least try to measure it. And this tutorial, it gets at measuring that intracluster correlation. If that intracluster correlation is 0, well then fine, everything's great. But if it's not, it can come back and bite you. You will say it's significant when in fact it's not. It's not significant.
Yeah. So I think that's the crux of it right there, right? We don't know until we measure it, and you're going to keep telling us how to measure it in these examples, which is fantastic. So keep going.
All right. So I guess the upshot is record that cage identifier and put it as one of the independent variables into the statistical model. And if that comes back as estimated to be 0, if the intracluster correlation is estimated to be 0, woohoo, that's great. But if it comes back to not be 0, well then at least you have treated the data correctly. And the inferences, the p-values, are as they should be. And they are not artificially too small.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm so thankful to you to be able to synthesize this to make clear sense.
So when we account for cage as an independent variable in our model, the statistical analysis will tell us whether or not that cage variability is 0 or not. When it's 0, everything is fine. And when it's not, well, then we still have correct results. In the examples I gave one where I said non-negligible cage variability. And there we've got this chlamydia model, and we're looking at natural killer cells, accounts of natural killer cells. NK is the variable there. And we account for cage, put that into the model, and we see that, there is cage-to-cage variability. That means that the observations among cage mates are correlated at least a little bit. And so then we get the correct statistical tests out. On the other example, the CD4 cells, when we count those and analyze those, we put cage into the model, and it comes back that the cage-to-cage variability, it's 0. So it doesn't matter. The results would be essentially the same as a 1-factor ANOVA. However, I cannot know that unless I stick cage in there as a variable. When we do this with good statistical software like the free JASP software I illustrate in the paper, if the cage-to-cage variability is 0, well, then we get the same thing as a one-factor ANOVA. And when the cage-to-cage variability is not 0, we get a correct analysis. So it's the right way to go. I'm talking about the statistical analysis business, but what's really important, though, is this idea of the 3 R's, refinement. We want to refine our statistical analyses so that we don't waste the data from these animals. But when we think about these things beforehand, it turns out we can reduce the number of animals that we use. When in this paper, I go through the sample size calculations and the effect size calculations. If you figure into your animal numbers that there may be some correlation, some intracluster correlation among your animals, well, then you can compute the sample size that you need. And it turns out that the more cages that you have, the better. It turns out that cages are effectively the experimental unit. So if you can increase the number of cages, that's a good thing. But when you have a limited number of animals, take your animals and spread them out among those cages. Suppose I want to compare 2 groups. When I think about putting 5 animals in a cage, that's what I usually do because it's cheaper that way for cage costs. Well, then I'm going to need 3 cages with 5 animals in a cage for each group. So that's 15 for one group and 15 for another group to be able to detect a reasonable effect size. So the paper spends a lot of time on these statistical analysis, but let's back up for just a minute. Our science starts with a research objective or a research question. With that research objective in mind, we design an experiment to answer that objective. Well, the statistical analysis flows from that experiment design, or at least it should follow that experiment design. Here we're talking about same group cage mates. That's part of the experiment design. That cage information should be part of the statistical analysis. Now, before we can do any sort of power analysis, we have to know what the statistical analysis is that we're going to use. So it starts with objective, then experiment design, then statistical analysis, and then power analysis. Now, on this power analysis business, we've got to justify our animals, and that's good and right, as we should. So in order to perform that power analysis, though, we do have to make some assumptions. And those assumptions in this experiment design, one assumption we have to make is what that intra-cluster correlation may be. We give some data on potential intra-cluster correlations among some weight variables and some behavior variables. But when you have this assumption of the intra-cluster correlation, we need to use that in our power analysis. When we incorporate that intra-cluster correlation into the power analysis, it turns out that we learn that more cages with fewer animals per cage is a more powerful experiment than if I have fewer cages with more animals per cage. If, for example, I have 24 animals, this is from figure 2. If you've got 24 animals, if I spread those animals out over several cages, I'll have more power in my statistical analysis. Let's look at figure 5 for a minute. Figure 5, I've got 2 groups that we want to compare, E for experimental and C for control, and we've got 24 animals for this whole experiment, right? So one experiment design is to put 4 animals in each cage. And that's what a lot of researchers will do. They will stack up those animals in a cage, often because it's cheaper if they are charged cage per diems. However, a more powerful design turns out if we take that same 24 animals and spread them out not amongst 6 cages, but amongst 12 cages. If I've got 12 cages, that's just a more powerful experiment, whether that intracluster correlation is quite small or larger. You just have a more powerful experiment that way. If I have 24 animals spread out among 12 cages, let's say the power is, I'm making this up, let's say the power is like 90.92, which is really great. And when I have 4 animals per cage, the power is more like 0.8. Well, 0.8 is acceptable power. So what if I drop some of the animals that I was planning on using? And again, I'm making this up, but let's say that I drop 2 animals from each group. And so I have 20 animals, spread that out amongst 10 cages, and it has a power of about 0.8. Again, making that up. I've reduced my animal number by 4. Now, folks have pushed back to me. They said, Reid, it costs so much to house these animals. But my question to them is, how much does it cost for an animal? When you buy just a young, like C57 black animal, it's like $30, maybe $35. Whereas a per diem charge is $1 a cage, or maybe 50 cents to $1 an animal. Think about that for a minute. It would take 30 days for that cage to equal 1 animal cost. So if I save 4 animals, not only do I save 4 animals from a reduce the animal point of view, I also save 4 animals worth of costs. Again, if that's $30 an animal, that's $120. That's great. So when we think about this stuff beforehand, we can reduce our animal numbers, and that will reduce our costs. In the paper, I run through some example calculations for cost analyses, and I'll admit that those cost analyses assume that the per diem charges at your facility are based on a cage. I have learned since that a lot of places will charge a per animal, charge their per diems on the animal instead of the cage. When that's the case, no matter what, the fewer animals you need to conduct the experiment, the cheaper it's going to be. You'll see when you do if you look at table 1, for example, it shows the different number of cages and equivalently the number of animals you would need to have power equivalent designs. A power equivalent design is, for example, 16 animals housed 2 to a cage versus 30 animals housed 5 to a cage. They would have the same power to detect the particular effect size. Well, obviously using less animals is better. So table 1 in mind, we can use that to get an idea of how many animals we really need.
I just wanted to jump in and comment on that because I feel like this is such a mind shift and such an interesting way to look at things. And I really am hoping that folks listening will take this to heart because, you're teaching us a few things here. One is you need to do this stuff ahead of time. So this isn't, let's figure out the stats after the experiment kind of thing, right? This is proper planning, good and right, as you said from the very beginning. And then when you're talking about the costs, it's just mind blowing to think about, hey, how about a different way to calculate per diems? Because really, the right thing to do, it sounds like, in these situations is A, account for the cage variability up front, and B, then think through how are you going to house these guys and it might be better to house fewer animals in more cages. And if that is what is going to happen, to get around that pushback from PIs saying, "Hey, that's great, but my per diem rate just, quadrupled." It's this idea of, "Hey, let's talk about really per diems." I mean, I think you're really opening that
Well,
door.
we talk about power.
Yeah.
So they're worried about the per diem charges, and I get that. However, if when you use a smarter experiment design, you can use fewer animals and have the same power. So
There
when
you
you
go.
have
That's it in a
fewer
nutshell.
animals and the
Yes.
same power, well, then use the experiment that has fewer animals. Thinking about the 3 R's, really cost should not be figured into that. We shouldn't be thinking about cost when we're thinking about the 3 R's, but let's be real, people do. And so it turns out that, yeah, you can save money when you reduce your animals, because the animals are so expensive. People think about these per diems, but just one animal, $30 for one animal seems it's probably a low end value for a lot of animal experiments that are done. When you think about the cost of the animal itself, and then all of the time and assays you do on that animal, you figure that into the cost, and the cost of one animal is a lot more than 30 days per diem, maybe even 60 days per diem.
Yeah, and I think you're proving that with math, which it's hard to negate. So this is so great. All right, so let's keep going because you have some other really great kind of examples, and you've also introduced non-statistics people like me to JASP. And it would be great for you to talk about that because that seems like something the average layperson could potentially use, and we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure. So it's a free open source software. That means that people can help in the development of it. It's designed by statisticians, but they designed it for people who are not statisticians, and that's important. I know that there are some proprietary statistical softwares that a lot of animal users use. However, there's at least one of them that I checked out. It was very difficult, if not impossible, to account for this cage in their software, account for this cage effect in their software. So JASP allows us to do that, and will also produce the R code. R is a statistical software that a lot of statisticians use, a lot of people use, not just statisticians, so that it's reproducible from by other people. Your results are reproducible by other people. So JASP I used it because it's made for biologists. It's made for people who are not statisticians, but still is a statistician can pick it up and go, oh yeah, I see how this all works. Whereas maybe on some proprietary softwares, it's not always that way.
Oh, and I so appreciate you sharing that. Also, just to let our readers know that this is an article in JLAS that has some supplemental materials, one of those being, or two of those being the coding. And so anyone who has access to the article can pull down those supplemental materials and would find those helpful as well.
Hopefully, yeah. So I wrote some R code in the supplementary material that you can change some of your assumptions and take that R code and put it into an R console off the web that you can search for and come up with your own calculations. Hopefully that should work. I tested it out several times with some other people, and we were able to verify that it was doing what we had hoped. So hopefully that can work.
Oh, that's great. Thank you again. I know there'll be a few readers taking you up on that. So thank you. All right. Well, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. And I hate this part of the interview because it seems like we could just be talking about this for a long time, which is something I didn't think I would say about dealing with Biostatistics. But I've so enjoyed, Reid, talking with you. And I'm not kidding when I said my brain is kind of exploding on some of these just amazing concepts, I think is how I would describe it, that an IACUC could really, could really have some good discussion over. And I think you've really helped our industry quite a bit. So we come to this part in the interview where I ask a final question. And if you've listened to the interviews, you kind of know what I ask, but this is going to be yours. So what advice would you give somebody who is, maybe just starting out, or they've done some research work and they really are want to do it better? What advice would you give for them to improve this kind of scientific quality of their animal experiments? But really, I think this could be extrapolated to kind of any experiment. But what type of advice would you give them from a statistical, kind of expertise? What would you
Sure.
say? Yeah.
Sure. I guess my main thing would be to make sure your statistical analysis plan, how you plan to analyze your data, lines up with your experiment design. Researchers tend to have their bread and butter experiments. They do the same sort of experiment design again and again. They'll change different groups or different treatments that they're studying, but they'll use the same idea several different times. If you take some time at the start and figure out, well, what's the correct analysis for this experiment design, how I had these animals lined up in space and time, well, then you'll come up with a better use of your animals because you'll use their data correctly. Suppose you go see a statistician, and I'm just making this up, but you do it for a consulting charge of $100 or maybe even $500. That's like 10 animals. And think of how much animals, that's the cost of 10 animals maybe. Think of how many animals you can save in the future and how much time and effort you can save in the future when you make sure you have your statistical analysis line up with your experiment design. That's the one thing I would want to say. And then the last thing I'd want to say is if you do have a same group cage mates type experiment, do consider this idea of more cages with fewer animals per cage, and it'll improve your power and can reduce the statistical errors if you happen to analyze it incorrectly. So those are my two final thoughts.
Oh, thank you so much. Those were excellent final thoughts. And I'm sure you have a lot of other thoughts as well. And we're hoping maybe we'll have you on here again to kind of do a round two for those of us who want more information. But thank you so much for everything that you're doing for the IACUCs, for our industry. And thank you for, more than anything, for putting this pen to paper and submitting it to AALAS. We are extremely thankful for this submission. I know that it's going to help a lot of my colleagues. I'm excited to see what folks are going to do with this. I'm excited to hear more robust discussion around, more cages with fewer animals in them in the future. So thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for joining us on The Last Word, the official AALAS podcast dedicated to advancing laboratory animal science. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. To find out more about this guest or the conversation, download our show notes wherever you access this podcast. And please join us for our next episode. Until then, stay curious and stay connected.